Today we are going to be looking at the entire Scream franchise, and I'm going to give you guys my favourite twists and turns throughout the entire series. Before we get into it, guys, remember this is not a ranking. This also isn't my favourite to least favourite moments in the series. This is just some of my favourite twists and turns throughout the entire run of the Scream franchise so far. We're going to kick things off with the first ever twist of the series, the opening kill of Casey Becker in the original Scream movie. Drew Barrymore, of course, signed on to Scream during production and was pretty much billed as the star of the movie. She was on all the posters, her name was front and centre, and that's why it was such a twist when she was killed off within the first 15 minutes. I do also think the production and just how they actually set up that opening scene was done really well. I think if you look at a lot of horror movies of that time, not a lot was put into the opening scene. You had a kill here and there and it set up the movie, but they didn't really put a lot of love into that scene in particular. With Scream, they spent a good 15 minutes building up the character of Casey, particularly because, again, she is Drew Barrymore. She is someone the audience will go in caring about and they'll expect to get out of that scene alive. When she's killed off in a pretty horrible and brutal fashion, it does just set up the rest of the movie that anything can happen. Right out of the gate, Scream showed us this was a new type of format, with a killer who taunted his victims with horror movie trivia. Up until this point, the characters in horror movies weren't really aware of horror itself. Most of them didn't really live in a world where Jason, Freddy and so on were on the big screen. Whereas with Scream, we were introduced to characters who were fans of horror movies, and it just kind of added an extra layer and a refreshing touch to the genre itself. That also set up this feeling of uneasiness with the rest of the movie too. You had stars like Neve Campbell from Party of Five, you had Courtney Cox fresh off of Friends, and you didn't really know who was the star. As well as that, because you had all these big names and Drew Barrymore had already been killed off, you didn't know who was going to make it out alive. Next up, we got Billy and Stu being revealed as Ghostface. One of the many reasons this twist is so iconic is the idea of two killers instead of one. One of the many reasons I like Scream is the rewatchability of it. If you look back at the original Scream, there are so many notes thrown in there to show you that Billy and Stu are the killers. But in 1996, we weren't really familiar with there being two killers in a horror movie. Again, we had Candyman, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers. It was always this one killer terrorizing kids. So you weren't looking for two at that time. Having Billy pretty much be a red herring for most of the movie, but still be so suspicious just threw audiences off, and you didn't really know who it was going to be. I also love the idea of the killers being pretty much obsessed with horror movies and really giving a social commentary on the idea of killers being influenced by these video games at the time, these horror movies that were coming out, and what the effects of those had on young teenagers. I think that was a huge issue at the time. A lot of people were talking about it. You had a huge rise in violent video games. You also, of course, had the video nasties of the 80s. So those questions were already being asked, and it was fun to see that in a horror movie. Now, yes, the killers had other motivations, and I think that was great to bring that away from that commentary, that actually, in fact, Billy wanted revenge for what happened to his parents. The last act is Scream at its best, mixing fan love for the genre itself, but also talking about these really important issues, as well as the rules of slasher movies, mixing that all together and just giving us a really interesting final act of the film. Next up, we have Randy's death in Scream 2. This one, of course, came as a huge shock when it was first aired. I think everyone, pretty much horror fans definitely in particular, really enjoyed the character of Randy. He was the fan of horror movies. He understood the rules of the genre, or the rules of slasher movies in particular. So fans flocked to that character in spades. And seeing him get killed off in Scream 2 was a shocker, but I think the biggest shocker was that he was killed in the second act of the movie. I think if you look back at Scream, you will see most of the big characters make it to that final act. They make it to the farmhouse, and that's where things really kick off. With Scream 2, there were a lot of characters who were killed in the second act, but they weren't really important characters. So seeing Randy pretty much tell us the rules of sequels, that he knows what he's talking about, and then get killed off midway through, came out of nowhere. So I think people were angry at it, but at the same time it was a great twist, because just like the first one with Drew Barrymore's character, it just elevated the movie and made you feel like no one was safe. Next up, we have Billy's mother and Mickey being revealed as the killers of Scream 2. Now, Mickey's reveal as the killer was okay. It wasn't anything huge, but I did again like the social commentary on him wanting to go to trial, as him wanting to blame the movies, and that's how he would get away with it. Beyond that, his character was okay, but I really liked Mrs. Loomis. It kind of harkened back to Friday the 13th and other movies like that. And I like Mrs. Loomis as the killer. It's something you honestly just don't see coming. You see her character throughout the movie quite a bit, but she is a bit of a forgettable character. So when it's revealed who she is, I thought it was done really well, but also a good way to link it to the first movie. And I like that it was, as she says herself, good old-fashioned revenge. She wanted revenge for what happened to her son. So I think for her and Sydney and those scenes that they're involved in, it was some great dialogue, and it just again harkened back to the first movie and linked it all up. Another twist I liked, and this might be more of a controversial one, but it's Maureen Prescott's backstory in Scream 3. I think moving the movie away from Woodsboro and to Hollywood, particularly since these movies dissected film itself, just made sense. I think as well as that, at this point having 5 movies set in Woodsboro would have been a little bit too much, so I liked that they moved it to Hollywood and delved into her character herself. With Scream 1 and Scream 2, you can see the events that spiraled out of control unfortunately led back to her, so I think giving her more of a character and bringing her into the franchise did just make sense. Now, I don't agree with a lot of Scream 3. I think easily it's the weakest one in the franchise, but I like that they went back and looked at her character. Rewriting history, and particularly Billy and Stu's motives, didn't really sit well too much with me, but what I did like is they focused on her time in Hollywood, and they actually looked at what we now know as the casting chair or the casting couch. They looked at what we're seeing today with the Me Too movement, what these producers really got away with young Hollywood stars, and how it essentially messed up her entire life. It led her down a very dark path, and you do see all of that play out on screen. I think that was actually quite ahead of its time, and looking at it through today's lens, it's quite interesting. It's a harrowing, horrible story, and I like how it led back to that first film again. If this is a trilogy and secrets do eventually come out in trilogies, it does make sense that it's all going to come full circle. Next up, we got the opening of Scream 4. At this point, the Scream openings had honestly become just as important as who the killer was at the end of the film itself. Although not as interesting as the opening of the first 2 movies, Scream 4 went all in and became the most meta entry of the entire bunch, with a huge amount of who's who of Hollywood young stars of that generation. There was a huge opening cast when you watch that movie back, and there's a lot of got you moments. So it is pretty much playing with the whole movie within a movie. It tears down the whole thing about reboots, about sequels going on forever, particularly Saw at that time, and it's just a lot of fun. But I will say that opening is still quite weak. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun twist, and it was definitely something I didn't see coming, but the actual opening itself with the first victim of Ghostface was a bit meh. Finally, we have the reveal of Jill, Sydney's niece, as a killer in Scream 4. So the Scream franchise has always given a commentary on different things when it comes to the horror genre. The first movie looked at the effects violence movies and games have on teenagers. The second movie delved into sequels. The third movie delved into trilogies, and Scream 4 looked at reboots. But at the same time, it did really look at what was changing in the world, how people wanted to be famous and they just wanted to attach a name to something and profit off of it. I thought that was quite fun because it pretty much did what Scream 4 was doing anyway. A production company wanted to bring it back just to make money, and it made fun of that. But at the same time, it looked at Jill and how she wanted to become famous by just becoming the new final girl. She pretty much wanted to create an entire new massacre where she could survive and become the new final girl. I thought it was really interesting. I do think it was maybe ahead of its time, 10 years ahead of its time. If Scream 4 came out today, it would be very interesting and very fascinating to look at the effects the newest generation of teenagers in these movies had. But I think with Scream 4, it's still a very interesting idea. I think Jill being revealed as the killer was again quite shocking and original because she was set up as carrying the franchise on. We were told there was going to be a new trilogy after this, and she was going to be the new final girl. So seeing her revealed as a killer was again something I don't think anyone saw coming. Still though, the idea was they were going to continue with her character after this. There was words that basically Sydney was going to be in a coma for Scream 5, and we would follow more characters with Jill. We would see would she get caught, and it would have honestly just changed up the entire franchise going forward. It might not have been a whole whodunit, but instead following the killer trying to get away with the murder. So I think it's unfortunate that Scream 4 underperformed at the box office when it came out, because it would have been a really fascinating trilogy to completely change the entire franchise. But guys, look, they are just my favorite twists and turns in the Scream series. Make sure guys, as always, you let me know what yours are down below. If I've left some out, drop it in the comments and let me know what your favorite twist is. As well as that, as I said guys, if you're excited to see Scream 5 in January, or as its title Scream, make sure you let me know, what are you most excited to see? Are you excited to see the legacy characters return, or where the franchise goes next? Remember guys, as well, if you like this video, you can of course click any of the links down below, and I will see you guys in the next one.